there is a crop that should not exist in the modern world. It breaks too many rules. It yields like a machine, survives like a weed, and returns like a ghost. Plant it once, and the ground remembers. Year after year, without asking permission, without demanding seed catalogs, contracts, fertilizers, or corporate blessing, it comes back, quietly, aggressively, reliably. It feeds people in the cracks of empire. And that is exactly why it vanished. Because the modern food system does not love the crops that feed people most freely. It loves the crops it can standardize, ship, patent, tax, and sell back to you every season. It loves dependence. It loves predictability. It loves obedience. But this plant is none of those things. It is unruly. It is stubborn. It is almost impossible to eradicate. Once it takes hold, it spreads underground through living chains of tubers and rhizomes, storing abundance beneath the soil like a secret waiting out history. This is the story of the sunchoke, also known as the Jerusalem artichoke. A crop born in North America, carried across oceans, embraced in famine, cursed in war, forgotten in peace, and now returning at the very moment. Industrial agriculture is beginning to crack under its own weight. Before we go deeper, take 1 second to do something that matters. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this vault with someone who still believes the old knowledge was primitive. Because the truth is harsher than that. Much of what we forgot was not inferior. It was erased. And what was erased is often what made people hardest to control. The story begins long before modern nations, long before commodity markets, long before agriculture became a spreadsheet. Along the eastern woodlands and around the Great Lakes, indigenous peoples knew this plant intimately. They did not treat it as a novelty. They did not dismiss it as a curiosity. They understood it as security, a reserve hidden in the earth, a living pantry that could survive weather, conflict, and neglect. The plant itself is almost theatrical. In summer, it rises tall, often higher than a man, sometimes reaching 8 or even 10 feet, with rough leaves and bright yellow flowers that echo the sunflower family to which it belongs. From above, it looks ornamental, almost harmless. But the real wealth is underground. Buried beneath the roots are knobby tubers in shades of cream, purple, and gold, packed not with starch like potatoes, but with inulin, a storage carbohydrate that gives them their peculiar sweetness and strange power. For many indigenous communities, this was not just food. It was insurance. Plant it once, and it remained. Harvest some and leave some. Disturb the soil, and fragments would regrow. A single patch could feed people for years, even generations. In a world where crop failure could mean death, that kind of persistence was not convenience. It was civilization-level resilience. Among the Iroquoian traditions, stories linked the plant to sacred origins, to sacrifice, to the body of Earthwoman herself. That matters, because the old stories often preserve what systems of power later try to bury: the recognition that certain foods are not merely calories. They are covenant. Memory. Survival encoded in myth so that no one forgets what keeps a people alive. Then the Europeans arrived, and as always, they mistook abundance for discovery. When Samuel de Champlain encountered the plant in the early 17th century along the northeastern coast of North America, he tasted it and compared it to the artichokes of Europe. That comparison would stick, warped by language and error, until the plant ended up burdened with one of the most misleading names in food history: Jerusalem artichoke. It was neither from Jerusalem nor truly an artichoke. It was a North American sunflower with a gift for survival. But names do not stop hunger, and Europe was hungry. Across the continent, soils were exhausted, Famine came in cycles. Agricultural systems were brittle, yields were uncertain, and peasants lived close to the edge. Into that world came a crop that seemed almost miraculous. It required little pampering. It tolerated cold. It grew in poor soil. It returned after harvest. It offered calories from land that was otherwise unreliable. In a starving age, that looked like salvation. So the plant spread. In France, it became topinambour. In Italy, it was tied to the sunflower in name and form. It entered gardens, peasant plots, kitchens, and eventually the diets of rich and poor alike. For a time, it seemed destined to become one of the great staples of Europe. And then the hidden conflict began. Not in the field, but in the logic of the system. Because survival alone is not enough for a crop to dominate. It must also fit the machinery of power. It must fit storage, fit transport, fit labor systems, fit taxation, fit markets, fit the eye of a merchant and the hand of a bureaucrat. The sunchoke was generous, but it was inconvenient. Its tubers were irregular and awkward. They were harder to clean, harder to sort, harder to process in bulk. They spoiled faster than potatoes. They were less visually uniform. They resisted becoming a perfect commodity. That resistance cost them everything. As the potato rose, the sunchoke fell. The potato was smoother, easier to store, easier to count, easier to move through the channels of empire. It fit warehouses. It fit armies. It fit markets. It was not necessarily the better survival crop in every climate, but it was the better crop for systems built on scale and control. And there is the turn in the story. Because what looks like an agricultural choice is often a political choice wearing the mask of efficiency. In North America, the irony grew sharper. The very land where the plant had evolved began to treat it as a nuisance. Settlers preferred the annual crops they understood from Europe: wheat, barley, potatoes, systems based on repeated planting, repeated purchase, repeated intervention. The sunchoke did not require enough from them. It did not create enough dependence. It escaped the garden too easily, persisted too well, spread where it was not invited, and refused to die simply because someone had stopped valuing it. So it was pushed to the margins, roadsides, ditches, forgotten fields, scraps of land where neglected things survive. But history has a brutal habit of recalling the plants we tried to dismiss. When the Great Wars tore through Europe, food systems collapsed, trade routes shattered, fields were seized, harvests failed. Blockades turned entire populations into hostages. Suddenly, the crops that thrived only under orderly conditions revealed their weakness. And the old survivor, the ugly perennial in the ground, returned. During World War I, Germany suffered under blockade so severe that the winter of 1916 became infamous for hunger. People ate what had once been thought unfit for the table: rutabagas, scraps, substitutes, whatever the land could still provide. In that landscape of desperation, forgotten tubers mattered. The sunchoke was not glamorous. It did not arrive in triumph. It simply endured where other food systems had broken. Then came World War II, and the lesson grew even darker. In occupied France, food was seized at massive scale. Potatoes, grain, meat, dairy, anything transportable and valuable was pulled into the machinery of occupation and war. Ordinary families were left with what remained, and often what remained were the foods that modernity had already demoted as poor people's fare: rutabagas, turnips, sunchokes, vegetables associated not with pleasure, but necessity. For years, millions survived on those margins, and survival has a bitter aftertaste. The same crop that kept children alive in wartime became, in memory, inseparable from humiliation, deprivation, nausea, and fear. People ate it day after day, not because they loved it, but because the alternative was hunger. In the Netherlands during the hunger winter of 1944 and 1945, when famine deepened under occupation and transport collapsed, people dug in frozen ground searching for anything edible. Emergency manuals listed wild foods, substitutes, and overlooked tubers. Again, the plant returned, not as prestige, but as reprieve. That is one of the cruelest twists in food history. A plant can save your life and still be hated. Sometimes, especially then. After liberation, many survivors refused ever to eat sunchokes again. They did not care about nutritional theory. They did not care about resilience models or agronomic potential. To them, the taste belonged to the worst years of their lives. It belonged to occupation, to ration lines, to emptiness, to bodies thinning under war. So the crop was not simply abandoned, it was emotionally exiled. And memory can erase what bullets do not, but the plant itself remained what it had always been, dense with minerals, rich in potassium, iron, copper, magnesium, and B vitamins. Remarkable for its inulin content, one of the richest natural sources on Earth. Unlike starch-heavy staples that spike blood sugar, inulin moves differently through the body. It feeds beneficial gut bacteria, supports the production of compounds linked to colon health, and helps the body absorb key minerals. Long before nutrition science began speaking in the language of prebiotics and microbiomes, the plant was already doing what it had always done. Its weakness, of course, became a joke. The same inulin that makes the tuber nutritionally interesting can cause gas, especially for people whose bodies are not used to it. Modern culture, incapable of tolerating discomfort even on the road to adaptation, turned that side effect into a verdict, an entire crop reduced to punchlines. But even here, the story is more revealing than it seems. Because what industrial food values is not only yield or nutrition, it values immediate compliance. It wants a food that asks nothing of the eater, no adjustment, no patience, no learning curve. The sunchoke asks for adaptation. Cook it differently. Eat it gradually. Learn its rhythm. In another age, that would have been normal. In our age, it is treated as a flaw. And yet, the real scandal is not digestive. It is agricultural. The sunchoke is perennial. That means no yearly replanting from purchased seed. No annual tilling cycle tearing open the soil again and again. Its roots run deep. It can improve structure in compacted ground. It tolerates cold that kills more delicate crops. It can survive drought better than many annual staples because it stores its reserve beneath the surface, where weather cannot strip it away as easily. It grows on marginal land. It rebounds after neglect. It is, by its very nature, a challenge to the fragility of industrial farming. Ask yourself what kind of future rewards that. A future of stable climates, cheap fuel, global shipping, endless chemical inputs, centralized processing, and perfectly timed harvest windows. Or a future of drought, flood, crop disease, disrupted transport, and exhausted soil? That future is no longer hypothetical. It is arriving now. The crops that feed most of the planet were selected and scaled under assumptions of stability. Stable rain, stable seasons, stable supply chains, stable fertilizer markets, stable political order. But stability is breaking. Heat waves now move like hammers. Water disappears where it once lingered. Floods come harder. Cold snaps arrive out of pattern. Pest pressure shifts. Topsoil continues to vanish. And in that unraveling, the old overlooked species begin to look less primitive and more prophetic. The sunchoke was built for disorder. It does not need to be perfect under fluorescent supermarket lights. It does not need to survive 6 months in cold storage to satisfy the logistics of long-distance retail. It does not need to fit a harvester designed for some other crop. It only needs to do what it has always done: return. That, more than anything, is why it never fully disappeared. Even when ignored, it escaped. Even when cursed, it lived. In home gardens, it spread too far. In abandoned corners, it naturalized. In old patches, it waited underground, ready for the next person curious enough, hungry enough, or desperate enough to dig. Then, in the late 20th century, the crop began to stir again. Not as a staple of empire, but as a survivor's rumor. Growers, chefs, gardeners, and small farmers started rediscovering it. In California, one produce wholesaler recognized that even the name had become an obstacle. Jerusalem artichoke sounded foreign, confusing, and inaccurate. Rebranded as sunchoke, the tuber entered specialty markets with a different aura. Chefs embraced its nutty sweetness, its crunch when raw, its creamy richness when roasted or pureed. What war memory had buried, cuisine began to recover. But restaurants were only one layer. Beneath that was a larger question. Could this crop serve not merely as gourmet novelty, but as a foundation for real resilience? During the farm crises of the 1970s and 1980s, some believed the answer might be yes. Sunchokes drew attention as a possible multi-use crop for food, feed, and even fuel production through fermentation. The economics were messy. Infrastructure was missing. Markets were immature. Large-scale adoption failed. But the experiment mattered because it exposed something larger. This plant kept reappearing whenever people began searching for independence from centralized systems. That pattern is not accidental. The same thing happens again and again with indigenous and traditional crops. If a plant feeds people while reducing dependence on markets, it is often neglected, mocked, or erased unless it can be transformed into a profitable niche. We call such plants primitive, invasive, impractical, unsuitable. Yet so often, what we really mean is this: they do not fit the structure of ownership we built around survival. The sunchoke cannot be neatly patented as a new invention. It cannot trap farmers in a yearly purchase cycle the way many annual systems do. It multiplies itself. It escapes management. It turns edges into food. That makes it hard to monetize at the scale modern agriculture prefers. And what cannot be cleanly monetized is often treated as if it has no value. But value is not the same as price. Never confuse the two. A crop has value if it feeds children when trucks stop moving. A crop has value if it lives through a hard winter. A crop has value if it restores battered soil, reduces tillage, tolerates marginal land, and asks less from a farmer already stretched to the edge. A crop has value if a household can plant it once and harvest it for years. A crop has value if it gives ordinary people one more layer of sovereignty between themselves and hunger. By that standard, the sunchoke is not marginal at all. It is one of the great forgotten weapons against fragility. And still, most people have never tasted one. Think about that. A plant that may outyield more celebrated staples in the right conditions. A plant that can survive extreme cold. A plant with powerful nutritional properties. A plant that asks for little and gives for years. A plant that once crossed oceans, outlasted famine, survived war, and sheltered itself beneath the feet of empire. Most people today know it, if at all, as an oddity at a farmer's market. That is not an accident of taste. It is a failure of cultural memory. We are trained to believe progress always moves in one direction, from old to new, from wild to managed, from local to industrial, from memory to system. But sometimes progress is simply amnesia with better packaging. Sometimes the thing left behind was not worse. It was harder to own, harder to regulate, harder to fold into a chain of dependence. So it was dismissed, not because it failed, but because it succeeded outside the approved model. The sunchoke stands as living evidence of that possibility. It teaches a dangerous lesson: that abundance can be decentralized, that resilience can be perennial, that not all food security must pass through the gates of industry, that the soil still remembers systems of nourishment older than markets. And maybe that is the deepest reason this plant matters now, not just because climate pressure is rising, or because food systems are vulnerable, or because nutrition science keeps rediscovering what older cultures already knew. It matters because it restores a forgotten imagination. It reminds us that another relationship with food is possible, one less fragile, less extractive, less dependent on endless intervention. 3 tubers in autumn can become 30 in spring, not metaphorically, literally. Left alone, a patch expands. Tended with care, it becomes a recurring reserve. That is not a miracle. It is simply a form of abundance we were taught not to take seriously. But the ground still takes it seriously. Beneath roadsides, beside old fences, in forgotten gardens, across cold soils and neglected corners, the plant waits. Not vanished. Waiting. Waiting for the next collapse in confidence. The next generation of growers asking harder questions. The next families looking for food that returns. The next communities tired of depending entirely on systems that fail from the top down. We did not lose this crop. We lost the habit of seeing it. And habits can change. So remember the name: sunchoke, sunroot, topinambour, Helianthus tuberosus. Call it whatever your language allows, but do not call it useless. Do not call it obsolete. Do not call it primitive, simply because it does not flatter the industrial imagination. This plant fed native peoples long before colonial agriculture remade the land. It crossed the Atlantic into a starving Europe. It survived fields, occupations, blockades, winters, and scorn. It nourished the desperate, even when they cursed its taste. It healed soil while more famous crops exhausted it. It waited through centuries of neglect without asking to be remembered. Now, in an age of instability, it returns with a question. What else did we bury because it made people too independent? That is the real vault opening here. Not just one forgotten tuber, but an entire buried pattern. The most resilient foods are often the ones pushed out first. The freest crops are often the ones treated as weeds. The plants that refuse dependence are the plants history keeps trying to demote. And still, they grow. So the next time someone tells you that survival must be bought, that resilience must be patented, that food security belongs only to giant systems and centralized supply chains, remember the crop beneath your feet, the one that outlasted empires, the one that fed the starving, the one that returns without permission. The soil is holding more memory than we are. If this vault opened something in you, subscribe to Nature Lost Vault, hit the bell, and share this story with someone who still believes forgotten things are gone forever. Because they are not gone. They are waiting. And sometimes the future of survival is not in the newest invention, but in the oldest root still alive in the dark, ready to rise again.